Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you again for joining us for another Permian Basin Adult Literacy Center live stream show. Again, I want to thank Southwest 66 Credit Union for sponsoring all of our 2021 live streams. We appreciate it. And today we are featuring Mrs. Alda Dobbs and her newly released book, Barefoot Dreams of Petra Luna, in honor of Hispanic and Latino Heritage Month. Welcome, Alda. We are
Thank
so happy to feature you.
No,
And
go ahead.
yes, I was going to say, our viewers may get confused with our names today, but we'll be able to get through it, I think.
Exactly.
We're so happy to have you here.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much. I was really excited when you reached out, just because like we were talking earlier, I'm from the Houston area, and that seems so far away, but it's still Texas, So just the fact that you reached out to me, I was honored. It was a true blessing, to be contacted by you and be able to talk to people there.
Absolutely. I heard a little blurb on our local NPR station, and you were talking about your book, and it just automatically caught my attention. I was like, we've got to feature her. This is a perfect book and author to feature for Hispanic and Latino Heritage Month this month. So, Alda, if you'll introduce yourself and just tell our viewers a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Yeah, I was born in Mexico, northern Mexico, and I moved to the United States, to San Antonio, when I was a baby. So I pretty much grew up in San Antonio. And it took me years to learn English, even though I started school in the States, because everything was in Spanish, my neighborhood, my family. So it took about a good 4 or 5 years to learn English. And I always had that lack of confidence. So I love storytelling, but I didn't feel that confident in English, and I was a reluctant reader, and I kept, kind of a dilemma inside my head whether I should be a writer or not. And when I went into college and did my placement test, English, I bombed the test. It was terrible. So I said, you know what, that's a sign. I shouldn't be a writer. And I went into engineering and physics and got my degrees in that, and worked as an engineer before my husband's the one that pushed me. He said, okay, I know you've been wanting to do this all your life. Just do it now. Now's the time. Right. I started writing, and that was 10 years ago. And finally, I'm here now. I got my first book out in the world.
Well, congratulations. Thank you for not giving up on writing and books. Well, our focus here at the Permian Basin Adult Literacy Center is adult literacy. So why do you feel adult literacy is an important topic?
Yeah, I think
especially for you, and I know you'll talk a little bit about that in your presentation later on, but just you personally, why do you think that's important?
I think like as a growing up as a reluctant reader myself, and also knowing that my grandmother and great grandmother too were literate. They grew up really poor, and for my grandmother, reading was so important for her, to the point that at 8, 9 years old, she was determined she was going to teach herself how to read and write, because she couldn't go to school. And by the time she was 12, she was able to read a few words here and there. So she broke the code some way, somehow. She figured it out on her own. And she always emphasized how important education was, and literacy and reading, and the empowerment you got from that. And so we took it as a family. We'd read books in Spanish and whatnot. Of course, when I moved to the States, I didn't have access to Spanish books, so it became hard for me. But I always kept that in the back of my head, how important literacy was. And at any age level, it's always empowering.
Well, your grandma sounds like an amazing woman, and you're going to talk a little bit more about her, because I know this book is not to spoil everything, but it's a lot about her. And so you talked a little bit about when you started writing. It's just very recently, but has it always been something that you were passionate about? It didn't sound like it. It's like something that you really struggled with, but how did you develop that interest over time?
I think I would read here and there. I would read books. I read a lot of nonfiction, of course, is my background, and read a ton of research papers for physics and engineering as I worked in labs. But not until I began writing did I realize, you know what, it's the same thing. When I applied for scholarships, when I applied for grant proposals, it was always pitching a story. It was always trying to influence something. So there's always that art of communication in writing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. You always have to set your mind to, how am I going to sell this story, to get the funding, to send the message. There's so much in there. So I realized, okay, I've always been a writer, just it's a different style, a different type. So that's what gained me the confidence. I said, okay, now that I have that confidence, I'm going to write. And the creativity, same thing. I think it's always been there. When you study physics, especially physics, I think you got to use your imagination to visualize so many things, so many abstract concepts. So it was the same thing. You translate that into a scene or a novel, you just picture, you try to visualize everything, and everything translates. So it just let me know how everything's just really connected and weave together. So there's no left brain, right brain, it's all together, creativity, whether you're an engineer or a writer, it's all the same.
Perfect. Well, this book, Petra, is so different from the world of physics and engineering. So you definitely have a very creative side to you.
Oh yeah, my mind's always out there somewhere.
So this book, in my opinion, was the perfect book to celebrate Hispanic and Latino Heritage Month, because it speaks so much about Petra's journey through the Mexican Revolutionary War and her journey to America as an immigrant. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about the book without spoiling it for them?
Yeah, no problem. So it follows Petra Luna, who's a 12-year-old girl. Her mom died during childbirth, so she's in charge of taking care of her younger siblings, which are Amelia, who's 6, and Luisito, who's a baby, and her grandmother as well. And her dad's around the picture until he gets conscripted by the Federales. The Federales are taking over a town. They're getting men to join them, so they force them into the Federales, and she promises that she'll take care of the family, upon his return. So that's the whole drama. And then the Federales come attack the town, and that's when she has to flee. She has to decide, okay, now I'm going to take charge and get my family to safety. And just like so many stories, you seek safety elsewhere in a different land. So her goal is to make it to the border, to keep her promise to her papa, to her father, to take the family to safety. And that's the whole drama of trying to cross the desert, coming across revolucionarios, which were the rebels, and learning about soldaderas and all the women soldiers, and just so many things, facets of the Mexican Revolution. And it was interesting trying to weave those, and then having her trying to reach that border.
Absolutely. Well, we talked about your grandma earlier and what an amazing woman she was. This book is a semi-biographical book based on your grandma's journey. And I think right now you're going to share a little bit more about her journey, about her, and a little bit more about the Mexican Revolutionary War, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions and a lot of misinformation about that, and people don't really understand that whole part of Mexican history.
Yeah, it's a very complex war. So yeah, it's always an honor to try to explain it, just because it's so complicated, but I'll try my best. So we have, okay, is it okay if I start? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah. So we have Barefooted Dreams of Petra Luna, and like Alba was saying, it's an inspiration. It's inspired. The heart of the novel is by my great grandmother. She's the one that struggled to get to the border, but my grandmother had the same poverty. She faced the same adversity. So their stories, they were only 14 years apart. So their stories are so similar. A lot of them were influenced by my grandmother, I'm sorry, who was very adamant and determined and just a fighter. And I just love that spirit that I had to put that into Petra Luna. So their stories were always passed down to my mom, who of course passed them down to me. So
all that right here is your grandma pictured in this slide here.
Yeah, so this is my great grandmother, and then my grandmother's here in the left, and then that's my mother and I. So yeah, she's the heart of the novel.
Several generations there.
Oh yeah. All right, you go to the next slide. And the stories were about their poverty, of the way they lived, and I loved hearing about their houses. Like they described it, it was an adobe hut with a thatched roof, and just how poor kids were. A lot of them were orphaned because infant, or not infant, but yeah, infant mortality, but also mothers dying in childbirth was very common back then. Something we take for granted now, but like my great grandmother, she was alone trying to raise her siblings. So if you could go to the next slide. And also the grueling work and the hunger. My grandmother talked about having to work since the age of 3.5. So if you can imagine a toddler having a job already, she's 3.5 or 4 years old, and her job was to herd the sheep or the goats. So she would take the goats to the river to get water, then to the pasture street, and then she would put them back in the corral. And this was, 2, 3 times a day, and every day, whether it was a storm or, if it was winter or summer, it didn't matter. That was her job. And she was 4.5, I think, when she got caught in a really bad snowstorm that almost killed her. But she was out there, doing the work because it was survival. They had to provide food for the family, otherwise they'd starve. And the times when there was no work, there was also a lot of hunger too. That she would describe that she swore that she would never allow her kids to face that same hunger because it was so painful. And she did it. So my mom never, thank God, never went through that same hunger. So, all right, the next slide.
Alda, before we move on to the next slide, can we go back to the previous
Sure.
slide? I know there's a quote from the book that says that she speaks about your mom feeling so much hunger that she couldn't even sleep.
Mm-hmm.
Or,
Yes. Yeah. She said that this was my grandmother, and her mother would say, when they were starving, they were hungry, they would say, well, let's take a nap, let's try to sleep, and maybe we'll feel better, and she said, I couldn't sleep. It was just so painful in the pit of your stomach that you feel nauseous, you feel dizzy, and you couldn't even sleep. You couldn't even think, you're just so hungry. So yeah, that is just terrible to think about children going through hunger like that.
And then you can see in these pictures, they're really just wearing rags.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's
how old is these kids? Is this your grandma?
No, I'm sorry. These are just pictures I found in the research that kind of verified the stories that I would hear about my great grandmother, my grandmother. When I saw the pictures, I'm like, this is what they were talking about, because she would talk about cutting wood, chopping wood to sell in the towns and carrying them on their back. And every time I came across a photograph like this, I'd keep it. I'd say, okay, this is something I got to write about and let the world know.
Absolutely. But I just wanted to comment on that. It's like, some of our kids nowadays live even in America, kids that are poverty live a better life than this. And so,
oh yeah, we take a lot of stuff for granted. It's amazing.
Yes, absolutely. Okay.
Yeah, and then it's something I tell people about percentages, or statistics that I learned during the research. Was like, one of them was about the population in Mexico, how much of the population, and you got to think of 1913 during the Mexican Revolution, how much of it was literate. So those are people who knew how to read and write. And then if you go to the next slide, it shows that it's only 20. So if you think about it, that's not that many, so literacy just held for that 20%. So, all right, you go to the next.
And Alda, before we move on, I wanted to say that we here at the Literacy Center see a lot of immigrants still and refugees that are illiterate in their own language. So this is still an issue.
Yeah, and that's the thing. We just think about ourselves here in America, but like you said, there's so many immigrants coming over from other countries where opportunities are the same. They're not available to everybody yet, like they are here. So people coming here, definitely, they're going to be more aware of that.
Move on to the next slide.
So these are pictures I found too that describe the interior of the homes my grandmother would describe. She would say that they kept things in wooden crates, and for mealtime they would just turn that wooden crate over and sit on it or on the floor. You know, so they had no furniture. They couldn't afford it. You know, they could barely afford food. So that was something it was. And then the next slide shows people, the rich people. This is how the contrast you see, you know, between these two households. So these people were, of course, the hacienda owners. They're the ones who own those massive land acreage and had peons, peasants working in their farmlands. And of course, the peasants had to buy their goods from the hacienda store on credit a lot of times because they couldn't afford the goods, and they were always accumulating a debt. So as long as that debt was there, they couldn't leave the hacienda. And the sad part was when that person passed and they had this huge debt, it would be passed on to their son, and that person had to pay not only their own debt but their parents' debt. So that's pretty much, it was, you'd never pay it off, and you were always tied to that hacienda. And
Yeah, so
you know,
there was not much of a middle class, was it? Just very rich or very poor.
Exactly. So you can move to the next slide. And this picture impacted me a lot and moved me a lot because a lot of the pictures I saw were either everybody was poor or everybody was rich. But here I saw both classes coming together. So you see these four ladies with silk, wearing silk, walking towards the camera. And then you see two girls on the right side. They're wearing ragged clothes like my great-grandmother and grandmother would wear. They're barefoot and they're walking opposite. And you see that one lady on the side, like tucking in her skirt and kind of giving a glance like, oh my goodness, you know, here they come, and, you know, trying to move out of the way. And I was so impacted by this picture that I created a scene, and you'll see it in the book. Cause I just to see that dynamic between both classes. And those, again, were stories that my grandmother would talk about, you know, coming across a rich and just a prejudice that they had in the social classes. So, all right, you can move to the next slide. And of course, the bare feet. You know, every story I was told, either my mom, my grandma, or my great-grandmother were always barefoot. So again, you know, something we take for granted are shoes. You know, we all have them here, but many countries in the world, like I tell children, a lot of people right now are barefoot because it's so expensive to buy shoes. And so back then it was the same thing, you know, so people were always barefoot, especially kids, whether it was snowing or ice. That's just the way it was. So the bare feet was something I wanted to add in the title just because how prevalent it was. And then the courage and dreams, because a lot of these kids had the dreams like my grandmother had and great-grandmother about learning to read and write. But there was so much oppression. And so they had this courage, like the grown-ups, to say, you know, enough is enough. You know, we're going to get together. We're going to fight. And those are stories I used to hear about my grandmother as well. So if you go to the next slide, we have another quiz. So what percentage of the Mexican population owned land in 1913? So take a guess.
I would say less than 10%.
That's pretty good. So if you go to the next slide then, so 1%. So only 1% of the population of Mexico own land. So those big haciendas, that's your 1%ers right there. And of course, 99% of the population lived, you know, struggling because land was so expensive. And then if you lived in it, more than likely it was an hacienda. You had to pay with work and do the crops you grew. So it was very rough living. And then if
the 1% have been around for a long time, haven't they?
That number, when I saw that number, I was like, you're kidding me. Oh my goodness. So, and then of course that oppression, you know, you have a revolution, you have people revolting, you know, because they just think it's unfair, it's unjust, you know, trying to survive day to day. So, and then that was sort of stories my great-grandmother would talk about because she was 9 when this happened. So if you go to the next slide. So this war I thought was very interesting because I would also hear talks about the federales and the revolucionarios, the rebels. So I always tell people, think of Star Wars, you know, you have the dark side and you have the rebels. but you can never really say it's a black and white, because like Petra's father in the book, he gets forced into the federales. So you can't say they're all bad guys, because a lot of them were forced. So the war was a lot more complex, more complicated than what we know, what we realize. And also this war, women and children were impacted a lot. A lot of women were soldaderas, so they followed their men into the war, and they would take care of them, they would feed them, they would wash after them. And what was interesting was that sometimes they would take their lunch to the trenches, and while their husbands were eating, or their sons or brothers, they would grab the rifle and start fighting the enemy. So, I mean, these women, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is incredible that they would do this. And they would give childbirth later on, over here on the side, and take care of their kids. So there were just these amazing women that I don't know how they managed. I complain about my busy schedule, and oh my goodness, what these women went through. So if you go to the next slide. And also children, that's another interesting thing too. Children could join the rebels, the revolucionarios, at age 12, and they would be treated as an equal. So they could join, and they would be trained how to fight. They would pay them a salary, and would be treated the same. And they were not forced. They were, allowed to voluntarily join. And a lot of them were hired as spies just because they're children. They could go to the other side and get intel. And this was also the first war that allowed women to join the war, and the rebels and the federales as well. But in the rebel side, women were gaining ranks as far as captain, and some of them made it to general, which was unheard of at this point in history. No other army or rebel forces had ever done that. So the Mexican Revolution was the first one that allowed women to reach ranks that high. So it's pretty interesting to see that happen. And if you go to the next slide. But my great-grandmother, her experience was, she was only 9, and she had younger siblings and her father, and there was so much violence happening, they had to run away because the federales were after everybody. So they crossed the desert. And you go to the next slide. And these are pictures I found about people just getting whatever was most precious to them and walking or running out the door. So a lot of it was just the clothes on their backs. And in this one picture, you see a little dog that the lady wraps around her rebozo, trying to, because that was more precious to her. So she crossed the desert with that dog. It just breaks my heart to see all these people doing that. So my great-grandmother described that, walking through the desert. And if you go to the next slide, you show the map of Texas. I guess it didn't show on here, but she was in the center of Coahuila, and she walked across the desert. It took them days, and she ended up in a town called Piedras Negras, and Piedras Negras is bordered with Eagle Pass. So if you go to the next slide, it shows a bridge where she got there, and this is the way it used to look before, and this is now. And she said that they wanted to cross, but the bridge was shut down. They wouldn't let them through. So they figured, okay, maybe the next day it'll open. And they waited 2-3 days, and it wouldn't open. The soldiers, the American soldiers, had it shut down. They had a gate there, and it was closed. And she said suddenly the federales show up to Piedras Negras. People start yelling, the federales are here, federales are here. So everybody runs to the bridge. And she remembers being towards the front. So she got there, and she could see the American soldiers standing guard at the fence, but you could see that they were, kind of in stress too, because they wanted to let these people in, but they have orders not to open the gate. So when people start yelling more, she turns, my great-grandmother turns to the hills, and she sees the federales that are coming down on their horses, and they know they're going to get slaughtered. She said, at that point, we knew we were dead. And people were pleading for their lives and begging, and at one point, the American soldier ran to the gate and unlocked the whole thing and opened the gates, and everybody ran through. So yeah, she always described that as one of the most joyous moment of her life when she ran through that bridge. That she said she was so grateful. She wanted to hug every American soldier there for letting her through with her family. So if you go to the next slide, my question was, because I decided to write an article about this for a kids magazine, and I told myself, okay, well, first, is it true? I really have to find out. So if you go to the next slide, I did detective work. I knew everything except the when. I don't know exactly when it happened, but I had done research about the Mexican Revolution, but I never found out, there's nothing that talked about that bridge crossing. So if you go to the next slide, I came across this. It's called the Portal to Texas History, and that one allows you to look at newspapers, really old newspapers that tell you events that happened during that time. So if you go to the next slide. So I knew that the Mexican Revolution started November 20th, 1910. So I said, okay, my great-grandmother's incident or bridge crossing had to be after that. So after about 7 months of reading every newspaper from 1910, it took me about 7 months. And then if you go to the next slide, I saw this headline that said, fearful scenes enacted in flight of refugees from Piedras Negras. So that was it. That was the article what my great-grandmother went through, and that was the date, October 5th, 1913. And it was exactly like my great-grandmother described it. She didn't stretch the truth. There was people screaming and pleading. The only thing that was off was that she said it was hundreds of people, and it was actually 7,000 people that had crossed the bridge. So I was like, oh my goodness. At that point, I said, I have to turn this into a book. So, and if you go to the next screen, so that's a picture I found from that moment. And just to think that somewhere in that bridge, my great-grandmother's there running for her life. So that was pretty impactful when I saw that. So if you go to the next shot, so that's people, once the refugee camps were settled, a lot of people moved on to major cities throughout the Southwest, like San Antonio. And then you could go to the next screen. And that's how you ended up having, little Mexicos throughout the big cities in the Southwest. And San Antonio had its own they used to call it Los Corrales in the West Side. So you could go to the next. And like I tell people about family stories, just the fragments that make us whole. These are fragments we have to collect from our ancestors to make us whole and shed light on these stories. So go to the next slide, please. And of course, the echoes of history. This is a picture I found from 1910s, 1912, 13. And the other one on the right is a picture of refugees that I found recently. And just to see the resemblance, the exhaustion, the despair in them, just wearing the clothes on their back, it's the same. And they're 100 years apart. So it's just amazing. If you go to the next one. Same thing with the crisis. You see that going on now. And then go to the next slide. The refugee camps, like the one my great-grandmother was in, you see that then, you see that now. And now we have COVID. Back then they had smallpox, which was another controversy. They didn't know whether they should keep refugees, send them back. It was a whole issue going on as well. So the next slide. Again, the adversities that we're facing, like you mentioned, that 1%ers, we're still facing that today here in America and all over the world. And then the next one is echoes of history, the spirit of giving. It's still there. People were giving back then to the refugees, and you see that happening now as well. So that's what I want young readers to take from this as well, that it's in them too to help out and empathize with migrants. All right, and then the next one. And that's another thing I tell readers, especially young ones, consider the losses. There's so much wisdom and stories in the elders. And once an elder passes away, all that is lost, all those volumes of information and wisdom and strength that makes us whole. So I urge people, it's like, go out there, get these stories, write them down and pass them on and teach children to do the same thing, to be curious about where they come from, where other people come from as well. So, and then the next slide. So I have resources in my website. I have a playlist from the Mexican Revolution, different videos if you want to look in there, and a newsletter too. And then the next one, those are just my contacts, my website. I'm sure you guys can make it available later, and that's it. So,
well, Alda, this is a great background to your story. Now we're just so pumped up. Can you read a selection from your book now for our viewers?
No, that's great. That's great. And there's also a book trailer. If you want to show it later, or we have time now, great. If not, that's fine too. It's up to you.
I think we'll once our interview's over, we'll put that video up for our viewers to watch.
Sure, that sounds good.
Want to read a selection from your book?
Sure, I will do that. I will read the prologue. It's called Citlalin Popoca, and it starts. I'll start reading right now. It says, "The smoking star lit the night sky as women wept, holding their babies close. Men kept quiet while the old and the weak prayed for mercy. It was on that night that all of us huddled under the giant crucifix, the night when everyone but me, awaited the end of the world. Everything was assigned to us mestizos, from eclipses to new moons to burnt tamales in a pot. I learned early on that all signs were bad. When sparks flew out of a fire, it meant an unwelcome visitor would show up. A sneeze meant someone was talking bad about you. If a metate, a grinding stone, broke, it meant death to its owner or a family member. But the biggest sign of all was Citlalin Popoca, the smoking star. Papa's big boss at the mine called it a comet. It was some sort of traveling star, he said, one that crossed our sky every so many years. To people like Papa's boss, that's all it was. But to us mestizos, it was the worst omen possible. The Aztecs, our ancestors, saw smoking stars as an omen announcing the death of a king. We had no kings, only a man who had been president since before Papa was born. And had he died, I doubted anybody would have missed him. These days, a smoking star meant something different. It meant war and famine. Yet others believed the star would come crashing down upon us, burning our homes and everything in sight. I didn't believe any of it. There had been plenty of unwelcome visitors to our hut, despite campfires. Tiny babies sneezed all the time. Who could possibly talk bad about them? And I can remember how many metates I'd broken in my life, but still, we were all kicking. My dream to go to school and learn to read had yet to come true. I did not plan on dying that night or anytime soon. Little did I know, soon enough, my world would turn into a nightmare. Still, in my heart, I believed that the smoking star wasn't to blame for halting my dreams, or for taking loved ones away, or for bringing a war to my doorstep. A war so horrific and frightening, it reminded me of the stories about the conquest of our people. Except this time, our enemy didn't come from a faraway land. Our enemy lived among us. So,
What like your readers? What is the biggest takeaway from this story that you would like your readers to take away?
oh my goodness, I have several, but I'll give you my best one. I think my best one is connections. This is a story of survival, of a journey, but it's not unique to Petra Luna or to my great grandma or to Mexicans. It's a story that transcends cultures, people, and time. So you have people right now escaping violence in their homelands. You see the Haitians that are trying to get here. You see Syrians trying to go to Europe, and 200 years ago, you saw the Irish famine. How they're trying to escape that as well, trying to come to America. So it's always happening. It's always repeating itself. So I want people to connect themselves and be more in touch with their roots, and see how we're all more connected than when we realize. When we see that, it's easier for us to empathize with one another, because we see that we all come from that same journey, that we all have that in our background, or it's now.
Absolutely. Well, what books would you recommend to people who want to learn about the Hispanic Latino culture, besides your book, of course? What are you reading, or what would you recommend if
Oh my
they want to
goodness.
learn and connect more with their Hispanic and Latino roots?
There's so many of them. There's one of them, of course, in the
Give us
children's.
your top five. Your top five.
The top five. Yeah, I guess Esperanza Rising always comes to my mind because I love that period of time, when migrant workers are working in the field and all that. So Esperanza Rising is a good one by Pam Munoz Ryan. And then I'm reading one called Escuba, and Escuba is by Leah Ashkena, and it's a nonfiction book, and it talks about her trip to Cuba and just how she saw Cuba as an American and how she really delved into the culture. And I learned so much from that book, and I'm still reading it. I think this is my second time, but yeah, that's a great book to get that perspective and see the resemblances too between other Latin American countries. And oh my goodness, I can't think. I love Laken Zia Camp. I like her book. She has a YA book called Somewhere Between Bitter and Sweet, and it's a really good book that touches on immigration issues and also a lot of food, which is good because it makes you hungry.
Coach, we love our food, don't we?
So that's a really good book. So no, those are probably my top three right there.
All right. Well, Alda, I know you just released this book, but what's next? What's next for you beyond this book?
Sure. Next is I have the sequel, the part 2. So this one's all in Mexico, Barefoot Dreams with Petra Luna, and it takes her to the border. Well, I'm spoiling it, I guess, but yeah. But book 2 takes her beyond that. It takes her to the refugee camps. And then after that, it follows her to San Antonio, to the city. So now she's there with 30,000 refugees trying to survive with her family again, trying to keep that promise about keeping her family safe and making her dreams come true one day about learning how to read and write.
And do you have an expected release date on that one?
Or a year from September 2022. So yeah, it's coming quick.
Perfect. Well, I'm excited, and I want to thank you so much again, Alda, for joining us today and telling us all about the Mexican Revolutionary War and about your grandma, and we're excited to tell the world about your book. And
actually, let me add 3 more books that I thought about just now. They just came to me. I've been working with these 3 authors and talks, and they are phenomenal authors. And one of them is an anthology called Living Beyond Borders by Margarita Longoria. And it's neat because it's so many different authors that give their experience as a Mexican American in Texas. So that one it's a must. I can't believe I forgot that one. It just came out last month, but it's beautiful. So that one, Living Beyond Borders, by Margarita Longoria, and then you have another one called Indivisible by Daniel. I call him Daniel Aleman, but people call him Daniel Edelman. So, but he talks about it's about a boy. It's a book like Petra Luna, but it's a boy coming to the States, and then his family gets deported, and he has to take care of his sister. So it's, oh my goodness, it's really heartbreaking too, of what he goes through, the character. So it's called Indivisible, and Daniel Aleman. And then there's another one called Love in English, and it's by Maria Andreu. And Love in English is neat because it's the teenage girl it's trying to learn English, and she takes different phrases in English and compares them to Spanish and vice versa too. And it's beautiful what she does with the languages, because I went through a lot of that, of why is it pronounced this way when in Spanish it's this way. And so yeah, that book I highly recommend it as well.
Well, it's especially hard learning English in Texas, right, Alda? We have y'all and all kinds of weird phrases.
It is. I remember walking into the board and seeing the word Plymouth written across, and the first thing when I read it, I said Plymouth, and so I said, oh, Plymouth, okay, I wonder what that is. And then when I heard him pronounce Plymouth, I'm like, wait a minute, why? That's ply as in plywood, and that's mouth as in mouth. And he's like, yeah, but when it's together, it's Plymouth. And I said, oh, you know what, I give up, I can't do this, so yeah.
Well, we will be in the comments if you would like to purchase Alda's books. We're going to put that in the comments, and and you can also look up her on her website, the resources if you want to learn more about the Mexican Revolutionary War. And if you follow Alda on Facebook, she also posts a lot of little history tidbits. So if you want to learn more about that as well. Alda, thank you again for joining us today. And we'll show you a short video right now.
Yeah,
Thank you, Alda.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
We'll see everybody next time.